They called her Quiet Brooke, and they meant it as an insult. That's what Dr. Sterling said to the charge nurse at 6:19 a.m., 2 minutes before the morning rounds began at Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland. He didn't know that the woman he was mocking had spent 20 years walking these corridors with a limp that got worse every shift, touching a scar beneath her scrubs like a sailor checking for land. He didn't know what those worn combat boots wrapped in a pillowcase at the bottom of her locker actually meant. What he saw was a nurse who whispered "excuse me" when she needed no permission, who moved through the ICU like she was trying to disappear into the fluorescent lighting. What he didn't see was the one thing that mattered. The lockdown had been grinding on for 6 months now, and Sacred Heart's ICU smelled like industrial bleach mixed with something darker, the particular scent of bodies under mechanical stress, of a hospital running 3 times its intended capacity. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that specific frequency that made your teeth ache if you worked doubles too many nights in a row. Brooke had worked 16 doubles. She didn't mention it. The other nurses knew anyway. They always knew. She arrived at 6:44 a.m., 15 minutes before her shift officially started, moving through the pre-dawn hallways with the kind of practiced invisibility that comes from wanting nothing from anyone. Her badge, clipped to the waistband of her scrubs, caught the light for just a moment as she passed the break room where the overnight staff was finishing their notes. Nobody looked up. This was exactly the way Brooke preferred it. Invisibility was a skill, and she had honed it to perfection over 2 decades. In the military, they called it discipline. In a hospital, they called it being easy to work with. The ICU bay stretched out before her like a cathedral of suffering. 12 beds. 8 occupied. Ventilators hissed their mechanical rhythm. One of the patients, a 73-year-old man named Patterson with septic shock from a perforated bowel, lay in Bay 7 with his pressure dropping like a stone. His blood pressure was 82/50. His lactate had climbed to 4.2. His skin had that particular grayish pallor that meant his blood wasn't delivering oxygen to the places that needed it most. Brooke read the chart without picking it up, just standing at the foot of his bed for 8 seconds, counting his respirations. 14 per minute. The ventilator was doing all the work. His own body had given up the effort. She moved to Bay 4 to check the central line on a COVID patient, a routine task, muscle memory, hand steady as a surgical laser as she assessed the dressing and the tubing. The patient's wife had called 2 hours ago during the night shift asking if her husband was going to make it. The night shift nurse, a kind woman named Rachel who'd been crying in the supply closet at midnight, had told her the truth: "We don't know yet." That was more honest than the doctors ever were. The sound of Italian leather shoes on tile announced Dr. Sterling's arrival before he physically appeared. That was the thing about Sterling, he didn't just walk through a room. He announced himself. His shoes were always polished to a mirror shine, and they cost more than most of the nurses made in 2 weeks. Brooke knew this because she'd once overheard him mention it to another resident, casually, while discussing a patient's lab values as if the 2 things held equal importance. He had connections to 3 board members, a brother-in-law who was a federal judge, and a tendency to smile like a wolf showing its teeth when someone challenged him. So far, nobody had challenged him. Nobody at Sacred Heart was stupid enough to try. "Quiet, Brooke." Sterling's voice came from somewhere behind her, and she felt the weight of his gaze like someone had just placed a hand on the back of her neck. "I'm still not sure why you're even on my service. You ever think about trying something less demanding? Maybe respiratory therapy. More your speed." The other nurses pretended not to hear this. Brooke had learned, years ago, that the best response to contempt was to act like it hadn't happened. She continued checking the central line dressing on her patient, her movements deliberate and precise. Her jaw tightened, just barely, barely enough that her teeth clicked together for a fraction of a second. That was her composure. Not trembling. Not burning red. Just a slight tightening of the muscles, and then it passed. She straightened the foot tubing and moved on to the next bed without acknowledging him. Sterling watched her go. She could feel his eyes on her back like a target being painted. This was new. Usually, his contempt was delivered and then forgotten, water sliding off glass. but something in the way he was watching suggested he was already thinking several moves ahead. Rounds began at 7:15 a.m. Sterling moved from bed to bed with his team, 2 residents, a medical student, and Rachel from the night shift who was trying very hard not to yawn. They stopped at Patterson's bed, the septic patient in Bay 7, and Sterling pulled up the chart on the computer mounted on the wall. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency across the keyboard, pulling up labs and vital signs like a conductor reviewing sheet music. Septic shock, Sterling said, more to the medical student than anyone else. Perforated viscous. We're already on broad-spectrum antibiotics. What we need is aggressive fluid resuscitation and pressors. He looked at the current medication list and nodded to himself with the kind of satisfaction that usually preceded a mistake. Start him on Levophed. 0.05 micrograms per kilogram per minute, titrate to maintain MAP above 65. Brooke was standing 3 feet away, and she heard the words land like a punch. She'd been reading Patterson's chart for the previous 4 hours during her prep time, and she'd seen something in his medication list that made her blood go cold. The prior shift, the 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. shift, had documented that Patterson had received an 4 dose of phenelzyne at 6 p.m. Phenelzyne was a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. An old-school drug, rarely used anymore, but Patterson's psychiatrist apparently believed he needed it for his depression even while he was dying of sepsis. It was in the chart. It was documented. And Levophed, norepinephrine, was absolutely contraindicated with MAO inhibitors. The combination could cause a hypertensive crisis. It could kill him faster than the sepsis. Sterling was already turning to leave, moving on to the next patient, his team following like a school of fish trailing the largest predator. Brooke didn't move toward him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't challenge his authority or suggest he'd missed something. Instead, she turned to the medication cart, pulled the chart up on the computer system with her staff badge, and verified what she already knew. Phenelzyne. Clear as day. 600 milligrams at 6 p.m. the previous evening. Then she walked directly to the ICU pharmacy window and placed a call to the pharmacist on duty, a man named Marcus who'd worked with her for 15 years and trusted her judgment completely. Marcus, she said quietly, I need you to verify something for me on Patterson in Bay 7. Phenelzyne in his MAO inhibitor list. She heard him typing. Heard the pause. Heard his sharp intake of breath. Holy, Marcus caught himself. Yeah, it's here. Who ordered Levophed? Sterling. Another pause. He didn't see the MAO inhibitor. I know, Brooke said. Can you call him before the resident puts it in? Marcus didn't answer. He was already moving. Pharmacy to doctor. Professional courtesy. A heads up before a potential complication. It happened all the time, these small interventions where the system caught itself before falling. The thing was, Sterling would take the call from pharmacy like it was normal. He would adjust the medication. He would think a pharmacist had caught a drug interaction during routine screening. He would never know that Brooke had read the chart well enough to see something he'd missed. He would never know that she'd prevented something bad from happening. That was the point. That was always the point. The medication line was never written. When rounds finished and Sterling reviewed the final orders, Levophed was gone. In its place was vasopressin, which was safe in combination with phenelzyne. Sterling glanced at the change, frowned slightly, and moved on. But he looked back. After he'd moved past Patterson's bed, after Rachel was already updating the family about the medication adjustment, Sterling turned and looked at Brooke. Not at her work. At her. At her face. At the small, practiced competence she'd tried so hard to hide. His expression hardened. Something calculating shifted behind his eyes like a door closing. She felt it like a change in air pressure. The morning shift continued. Brooke helped with a blood transfusion on one patient, adjusted a ventilator setting on another, documented medication administrations with the kind of meticulous precision that made her charts the gold standard for completeness. By 10 a.m., her feet were beginning to hurt in the particular way that meant the limp would be visible by hour 10. She'd learned to disguise it by shifting her weight in specific ways, distributing the pain so nobody would notice. The left ankle, the one that had a scar running along the Achilles tendon, had never quite healed right. 20 years of nursing shifts on concrete hard floors had taught her how to make it irrelevant. During the lunch break, which she took at 11:53 because that was 11 minutes longer than her official allotment and therefore probably fine, she walked to the locker room. The lockers were old, metal, institutional green, with locks that had been changed approximately 3 times since she'd started working here in 2002. Her locker was number 47. She opened it with her combination, still the same one, changed only once, a date that meant something to her in a way nobody here would ever understand. Inside, spare scrubs, a cardigan she never wore, a pair of compression socks, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a white pillowcase like something sacred, the combat boots. They were tan-colored leather, scuffed and worn, with laces that had been replaced twice. The sole on the left boot was slightly more worn than the right from the weight distribution through her ankle. She'd carried these boots through 2 continents, through a mission that no longer officially existed, through 20 years of pretending to be someone smaller than she actually was. They smelled like dust and memory and the particular ozone scent of desert wind. She reached down and touched the leather. Just once. Just enough to feel the texture beneath her fingertips, to ground herself in the fact that this was real. That she was real. That underneath the whispered "excuse me" and the hunched shoulders and the practiced invisibility, there was still someone who had once known how to move like apex predators moved, efficient and deadly and certain. Then she wrapped them back up and locked the locker. When she returned to the floor, Dr. Sterling was standing at the nursing station, reviewing something on the computer. He didn't look up as she passed, but she saw his jaw tighten. She saw him close the file with a deliberate click of the mouse. She saw his fingers curl into fists for just a moment before he opened them again. He was thinking about something. Something that involved her? The air in the ICU seemed to change pressure again, and Brooke understood, in the way she understood so many things without needing to ask, that something had shifted. Something small. Something that would grow. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was right. The nursing station at Sacred Heart fell silent at 7:51 a.m. when Dr. Sterling walked in carrying his leather wallet. He moved through the crowd like a man who owned the corridors, his presence making the fluorescent light seem dimmer by comparison. 23 nurses and techs stood at computers, reviewing charts, preparing for the day's shift, and Sterling positioned himself directly in the center, voice pitched loud enough that even the waiting room could hear. "I want everyone to witness this," he announced, pulling a $50 bill from his wallet and holding it up like evidence at a trial. His gaze swept across the room until it landed on Brooke, who was reviewing labs at the far terminal. "I want to make a wager with Linda here." He turned to the charge nurse, a woman who'd worked with Brooke for 14 years. $50 says Nurse Mouse over there quits within a week. Any takers? Laughter rippled through the station, the kind of nervous laughter that happens when power plants a joke and everyone present understands the real message: you can laugh with him, or you can be next. Brooke's fingers tightened on the chart in her hands. She did not look up. She did not flinch. Her breathing remained controlled, deliberately slow, in for 4, hold for 4, the meditation technique her field medic instructor had taught her in 2003. One measured breath. The room's ambient sound pressed in, the steady beep of monitors from the ICU behind her, the rustle of papers, the soft wheeze of the ventilation system overhead. She could feel Sterling's eyes on her like a physical weight. Then a single tear escaped down her cheek. She did not sob. She did not tremble. She simply tilted her head slightly, letting the tear roll down her skin, and wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the computer screen. The gesture was devastatingly quiet, the kind of visible pain that made the laughter stop immediately. Several staff members suddenly became very interested in their charting. Sterling watched her for 3 seconds, seeming to register that the response was precisely the one he wanted, then moved to the coffee station as if the performance had ended exactly on schedule. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Linda didn't take the bet. In 14 years, Linda had always had Brooke's back. This time, she just turned away and started reviewing the morning assignments. Brooke understood the message. She was already gone. 2 days later, Brooke pushed through the cafeteria doors at 12:34 p.m., her lunch tray balanced on one hand. She'd taken exactly 18 minutes away from her station, timed it carefully so she wouldn't fall behind. The cafeteria was crowded: nurses, respiratory therapists, dietary staff, visiting families, a human ecosystem of bright fluorescent light and the smell of institutional food and overcooked vegetables. Sterling emerged from the beverage station like he'd been waiting. He moved beside her with the casual grace of a predator, and when his shoulder made contact with hers, he did it with enough force to create maximum impact without leaving evidence. The tray left her hands before her brain registered what was happening. Soup splashed across her scrubs in a hot spreading arc. The tray clattered against the tile floor with a sound like breaking bones, plastic and ceramic shattering across 2 tables worth of space. Broccoli scattered. A puddle of vegetable soup spread across the floor like a medical biohazard. The cafeteria went silent. 47 people turned to look. Sterling stepped back with an expression of performative concern. "Oops," he said loudly, as if to the room. "Nurse Mouse should watch where she's going. Clumsy." He shook his head at nearby colleagues with the expression of a man genuinely disappointed in someone else's incompetence, then walked away. Brooke kneeled slowly. Her bad leg, the left one, shrapnel damage that never fully healed, protested as she bent, and she felt the familiar twinge in her hip socket, pain that was information, pain that meant she was still moving. She began picking up pieces of the broken tray, her movements economical and precise. One measured breath. One tear, barely visible this time, wiped away with the back of her hand. A dietary aide moved to help her, but Brooke gestured her away with a slight shake of her head. "I've got it," she said quietly. The voice was so soft that only the aide heard it. She collected every piece of ceramic, every piece of plastic, and rose without needing assistance, her expression completely neutral. She carried the fragments to the trash bin, dumped them, and walked back through the cafeteria to the bathroom to clean her scrubs. When she returned to the ICU 23 minutes later, her scrubs were wet but clean, and she said nothing to anyone about what had happened. But that wasn't the worst part. That came the next afternoon when Brooke attempted to return a stack of misfiled patient charts to Dr. Sterling's office. 3 months of shifts had accumulated administrative errors, charts that belonged in one patient's file but had been placed in another's, a cumulative mistake that now needed correcting. She'd identified them during her documentation review, had taken time from her station to reorganize them correctly, and had decided that returning them personally would be faster than waiting for someone else to deliver them. Sterling's office door stood open. She could see him at his desk, reviewing something on his computer screen. She approached carefully, her footsteps deliberate and quiet, the stack of 15 charts held at chest level. "Dr. Sterling, I have some misfiled charts from the past 3 months. I thought I'd bring them directly rather than—" He didn't let her finish. He stood up, walked around his desk, and took the entire stack from her hands. Then, in one smooth motion, he held the stack at chest level and dropped them. The air resistance was minimal. The charts fell like dominoes, papers cascading across the floor in a spread pattern that covered 7 feet of hallway. Patient names, medication lists, vital signs, and progress notes scattered like confetti. 3 residents stood in the corridor 15 feet away. They all pretended to be reviewing something on their phones. "Pick those up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice carrying the particular condescension of a man speaking to a child. He smiled, not a real smile, but the expression of someone enjoying the mechanics of power. "That's more your speed than actual medicine anyway." Brooke stood motionless for exactly 2 seconds. Her breathing remained controlled. Her posture did not collapse. Her hands did not shake. She took one measured breath. Held it. Released it. One tear escaped, not from sadness, but from the controlled restraint of someone holding back a fury so complete that showing it might end everything, and she wiped it away while maintaining eye contact. Her gaze locked directly onto Sterling's face, and for the first time, her voice when she spoke wasn't soft or apologetic. "I've cleaned up bigger messes than this, doctor," she said quietly. "Some of them even survived." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Sterling's expression shifted. For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes, not fear, not yet, but the first crack in his confidence, the moment when a man realizes that the person he's been crushing might have dimensions he hasn't considered. His jaw clenched. A muscle worked in his neck. He recovered quickly, his laugh resuming as he turned back toward his office, but the laugh had changed. It was brittle now, defensive, the sound of someone who'd just realized he'd been playing with something that could break in directions he hadn't anticipated. Brooke kneeled on the hallway floor, her left leg complaining with every movement, and began gathering the scattered charts. She organized them as she picked them up, methodical, precise, efficient. The 3 residents watched from their corner without moving. Nobody helped. But nobody laughed either. When she finished, Brooke stood up, balanced the reorganized stack in her arms, and returned to the ICU. She placed the charts on Sterling's desk without another word and returned to her station at 2:51 p.m. Her hands began to shake about an hour later, when the adrenaline wore off and she realized what she'd done. She'd revealed something, not her identity, but something underneath it, a level of authority and control that didn't belong to a hospital nurse. She'd spoken to Dr. Sterling like someone speaking down to a subordinate, and for just a moment, the power dynamic had inverted completely. She had shown him something. She hadn't meant to. But now it was visible. Brooke excused herself from the station and walked to the supply closet, the small one on the 2nd floor that nobody used, the one with the chemical smell and the single shelf of extra pillow covers. She stood in the darkness for exactly 4 minutes and let herself feel the tremor in her hands, the way her breath wanted to come in short desperate gasps, the weight of 20 years of hiding suddenly pressing down like a physical force. Then she straightened her scrubs. She checked her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall. She ensured her face was neutral, her eyes clear, her composure restored. She returned to the ICU at 3:04 p.m. and resumed charting. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sterling had already pulled out his phone while standing in his office, his expression darkening from irritation into something more calculated. He had 2 board members on speed dial, and he understood instinctively that Brooke Sullivan had just made a mistake. She'd revealed competence. She'd shown authority. She'd spoken to him without deference. That meant she had to disappear. The monitors came alive at 3:53 p.m. Captain James Harrow, 34 years old, Navy intelligence officer on administrative leave for a classified briefing, had been stable in ICU bed 7 until COVID pneumonia compressed his oxygen levels and something deeper went catastrophically wrong. His chest pressure spiked. His color grayed. The cardiac ultrasound showed what the resident, Dr. Mitchell, couldn't quite process, fluid trapped in the pericardium, pressing his heart like a fist squeezing a beating muscle. "We need a cardiologist," Mitchell said, his voice climbing an octave. "Page cardio right now." "No time." Sterling pushed past him into the room, his silk tie catching the fluorescent glare. "Start pressers. Get him on norepinephrine. Push bicarb. We're correcting for acidosis." "Sir," with tamponade, Mitchell's hands hovered over the 4 pump. "I said now, doctor. Are you questioning my orders?" Sterling's voice carried the weight of 17 years of board connections and surgical privileges no one dared challenge. Brooke stood at the vital signs monitor, watching the numbers collapse like dominoes. Blood pressure 90/58. Oxygen saturation 63%. Heart rate climbing past 140, racing itself toward failure. The captain's face had the grey-white pallor of someone whose body was shutting down, and every second that passed was another cell dying from hypoxia. Mitchell pushed the medications. Sterling barked more orders from the doorway, contradicting his previous instructions, creating a fog of confusion that made the nurses exchange glances that meant, "We're watching a man die while 2 doctors argue over treatment." The captain's skin turned ashen. His lips went dusky. His pressures dropping further, a tech called out. 87/45. We're losing him. Brooke's hands moved before her mind caught up. Muscle memory. Combat training. The kind of certainty that comes from holding people together in dark rooms when there's no backup coming. She grabbed the code cart. Found the 18-gauge needle. Her fingers knew exactly what to do, where the skin folded at the 5th intercostal space, how to angle for the pericardial sac, how to feel the give when you'd found the right layer. What are you doing? Sterling's voice cracked like he'd been slapped. She didn't answer. Didn't look at him. Her voice dropped 2 octaves, and suddenly she wasn't a nurse requesting permission, she was someone giving orders. I need the ultrasound probe. Now. The ultrasound tech scrambled. Brooke felt the needle finding its target, that microscopic moment when the resistance changed and she knew the pericardium was breached. The hiss of air escaping. The catheter sliding through. 60 milliliters of serous fluid drained into the collection chamber. 80 milliliters. The pressure in the captain's chest released like a breath held too long finally exhaled. His oxygen saturation climbed. 68%. 73%. The numbers climbing higher, higher. His color shifted from gray to pink. His lips lost the dusky tinge. Sinus rhythm. A proper heartbeat. The monitor showed what a living cardiac trace looked like instead of the flattening collapse they'd watched 5 seconds before. The captain gasped. His eyes fluttered. Consciousness bleeding back into his face. Sterling stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth open in a shape that looked like he'd swallowed something poisonous. Brooke still held the needle, her hand steady as a surgical laser. Her gaze met his for 1 long second, and in that second something fundamental shifted. He'd seen her as a timid nurse who could be dismissed. She'd just shown him a person who could perform procedures that required years of training, muscle memory that didn't come from nursing school, competence that existed in a completely different category than he'd imagined. He turned and walked out without a word. Mitchell stared at Brooke like she'd just removed a bomb with her teeth. That was, how did you, his voice cracked. We didn't even have consent for that. Captain's in cardiac arrest. Brooke's voice was flat, the same pitch she'd used to give orders. Consent comes after you're alive. He's alive. But that wasn't the worst part. Sterling knew exactly what he'd witnessed. A nurse performing an emergency pericardiocentesis, a procedure technically in the physician's scope of practice. A procedure she'd executed with more competence than a trauma surgeon. A procedure that had saved a Navy captain's life, which meant in exactly 3 hours, Sterling would activate every connection he'd cultivated over 2 decades of climbing the hospital hierarchy. At 2 p.m., he sat in his office with the door closed and made the first call. Richard Vaughan, board member, venture capitalist, the kind of man who measured influence in yacht clubs and polo teams. Richard, I need to flag a serious liability issue. Sterling's voice carried the concerned tone of someone protecting institutional assets. We have a nurse who performed a surgical procedure, a pericardiocentesis, without physician authorization or proper training. Technically outside her scope. The patient is stable, but the legal exposure is significant. I wanted you to hear it from me first. Vaughan listened. Agreed it was concerning. Said he'd mention it to the hospital president. At 2:51 p.m., Sterling walked to the legal department's 4th-floor office and filed a formal complaint describing the procedure as an unauthorized scope violation. He used phrases like safety risk and dangerous independence and made sure the written record existed before Brooke could explain what had actually happened. At 3 p.m., he called Sacred Heart's sister hospital in Eugene, where Brooke had worked from 2003 to 2015. The HR director was a woman named Carol who'd worked in nursing administration for 22 years and still remembered Brooke as someone quiet and competent, someone who'd never caused problems. Carol, I'm calling to verify employment records for Brooke Sullivan. Sterling's tone was professionally curious, the kind of careful interest that made people defensive. She lists you as a reference. I'm doing a background check and noticed there seem to be gaps in her history, employment record starting in 2003, but before that it's blank. Can you help clarify her work history between 1998 and 2003? Carol made a sound that meant confusion. Our records show she was hired in 2003. I don't have information prior to that. You'd have to contact her directly. Why? Is there an issue? No, just trying to be thorough. Anything you remember about her performance? She was excellent. Quiet. Good with patience. Never a problem. Sterling smiled into the phone. Thank you, Carol. Very helpful. He hung up and made a note, employment gap 1998 to 2003, 5 years unaccounted for. He didn't know what it meant, but it looked like something to exploit. At 3:45 p.m., Marcia Chen from Hospital Compliance arrived at the ICU with a notebook and the kind of formal demeanor that made everyone in the department tense. She'd been called in to review scope violations. Sterling had already prepared the narrative. He walked beside her, pointing to charts, framing Brooke's clinical decisions as concerning patterns of independent practice beyond scope. Here, Sterling said, pointing to a dosage adjustment Brooke had suggested 2 weeks prior, a standard nursing intervention that had prevented a medication error. She's making treatment decisions that should be physician-led. Chen made notes. Her expression remained neutral, but the act of reviewing, the formal investigation, the implication that something was wrong, it created a narrative that hung in the air like humidity before a storm. At 4 p.m., Brooke was called to HR. She walked upstairs knowing what was coming. The director, a woman named Patricia with nervous hands and averted eyes, couldn't quite meet her gaze. We're placing you on immediate suspension pending investigation into scope violations. Patricia's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone reading from a legal script. A formal complaint was filed this afternoon. We'll need to review your recent patient interactions. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. Brooke stood perfectly still. Her hands didn't tremble. Her face didn't flush. She simply nodded and walked downstairs to her locker. The combat boots were exactly where she'd left them that morning, the worn leather cracked with age, the soles thick and creased from 20 years of being carried in places that no longer officially existed. She tucked them under her arm like they were evidence. The security guard was kind. He didn't make eye contact. He walked beside her to the parking lot and she carried the cardboard box, 2 weeks of personal items, her nursing shoes, a photo of her daughter at the hospital spring carnival, a stethoscope, a pen that had fallen out of a pocket, to her car. She drove in silence. The rain started somewhere around Interstate 5, drumming against the windshield like applause for a performance nobody had wanted to give. Her hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough that her knuckles turned white, and she didn't loosen her grip until she pulled into her garage and the door came down behind her, separating her from the world for the first time in 12 hours. Meanwhile, in his office, Sterling texted Richard Vaughan, problem solved. He didn't know that the captain had regained consciousness at 5 p.m. and asked for the nurse with the steady hands and the voice that gave orders. He didn't know that the captain would ask his medical team if the name was Brooke Sullivan. He didn't know that when they told him she'd been fired for performing the very procedure that had saved his life, the captain would demand his medical records and make a single phone call to a number that hadn't been dialed in 20 years. Dr. Sterling's hands shook as he sat alone in his office, the door locked, the blinds drawn against the afternoon light filtering through the hospital windows. 3 hours. That's all it had taken for the emergency to unfold, for Brooke Sullivan to step forward with her needle and her impossible competence, for the entire hierarchy he'd built to crack like porcelain. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone. Not the trembling of fear, the trembling of rage so pure it vibrated through his bones like electrical current. He scrolled through his contacts. Board members. People who owed him favors. People whose children had received tuition assistance through hospital foundations he controlled. People whose country club memberships he'd quietly subsidized. The network wasn't just professional, it was personal, woven through 18 years of careful relationship management, each thread tied to leverage he'd accumulated like interest on a debt that never expired. The first call connected on the second ring. Richard Hayworth, board chairman, voice smooth as oiled leather. Sterling didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We have a compliance issue. One of the floor nurses performed a procedure she's not credentialed for. Cardiac intervention. Could have killed the patient." The lie sat between them like a stone in still water, heavy and perfect. Hayworth's voice hardened immediately. "Which nurse?" Sterling said the name slowly, letting each syllable carry the weight of accusation. "Brooke Sullivan. 20 years here, flying under the radar, and suddenly she's playing physician." He could hear Hayworth's breathing shift, the sound of a predator catching scent. "I'm documenting everything. You'll want to know before the liability team asks questions." The second call went to Patricia Vance, vice chair, a woman whose spine was made of institutional protocol and whose fear of regulatory scrutiny ran deeper than her blood. Sterling used different language with her, less direct, more procedural. "I'm concerned about scope creep. One of our nurses intervened in physician territory during an emergency. I need to know if our credentialing standards protected us, or if we have exposure." Vance said she'd call risk management. Within minutes, Sterling's phone buzzed with confirmation an investigation was opening. Then came the calls that felt almost surgical in their precision. Sterling pulled the file on Brooke's employment history, the one personnel had forwarded him months ago when she'd been considered for charge nurse promotion, a promotion he'd quietly blocked. St. Michael's in Seattle. Mercy General in Tacoma. Smaller facilities, community hospitals, the kind of places where people went when their careers stalled or when they were running from something. He made 4 calls to previous supervisors, his voice carrying the weight of formal inquiry. "Yes, I'm checking references on Brooke Sullivan. She's being considered for expanded duties here." Pause. "I noticed her employment history has some gaps. Can you help me understand her tenure at your facility?" The supervisors shifted uncomfortably, he could hear it in the quality of silence before they answered. One of them said, "She was excellent. Quiet, but thorough." Sterling pressed. "Any disciplinary actions? Any reason she might have left?" The woman hesitated. That hesitation was everything. "No, nothing formal. She just moved on." Sterling thanked them and disconnected, already moving to the next call, the next pressure point. The real weapon arrived at 2:38 p.m. Sterling heard the knock on his office door, then the entrance of Thomas Brenner, the hospital's compliance investigator, a thin man with a perpetually suspicious expression and the kind of institutional memory that made him dangerous. Sterling had called him directly, invoked protocol, triggered the machinery. Brenner carried a tablet and a folder so new it still smelled like printer toner. "I'm opening a full chart review," Brenner said, settling into the chair across from Sterling's desk. "You mentioned scope of practice concerns." Sterling nodded gravely. "I want to understand her entire pattern. Every patient she touched in the past month. Every intervention, every note, every decision. Look for pattern of unauthorized procedures." Brenner's fingers were already moving across the tablet. "I'll cross-reference with physician supervision, equipment access logs, anything that shows independent action." This was the moment Sterling had been orchestrating, not a direct attack, but a systematic dissection, each chart becoming evidence, each note becoming a brick in a wall that would seal her out of the profession. "Pull everything," Sterling said quietly. "I want this airtight." Brenner nodded and left, already absorbed in the work. Sterling sat back in his chair, the trembling in his hands finally beginning to subside, replaced by something colder and more durable. It was done. The network was activated, the investigation was official, the references were poisoned. By end of business, Brooke Sullivan would be a liability. By tomorrow, she would be terminated. By next week, she would be unemployable. He had dismantled people for far less. He would dismantle her. Security found Brooke in the staff room at 4:33 p.m., still in her scrubs, the fabric clinging to her skin with dried sweat from the emergency. The guard was professional, almost apologetic. "Ms. Sullivan? You need to come with me." She didn't ask questions. Her hands were steady as she gathered her things, a sweater, a small plant someone had given her 3 years ago, a photo of Emma in a wooden frame. The guard brought her a cardboard box, the kind used for holiday supplies, and she placed each item inside with the careful precision of someone packing a crime scene. The combat boots sat in her locker, worn leather the color of old sand, laces tied with military exactness. She pulled them out and tucked them under her arm, unwilling to place them in the box, unwilling to reduce them to a belongings inventory. The boots were the only real thing in this place. Everything else was costume. The walk through the hospital took longer than it should have. Colleagues averted their eyes. Word traveled fast in institutions like Sacred Heart. Everyone knew what it meant when security escorted someone to the exit with a cardboard box. A nurse she'd worked with for 8 years didn't acknowledge her. Another one, young, just starting out, looked at her with something like pity, the expression of someone witnessing a preview of their own possible future. The parking lot was grey and cold, the afternoon light draining from the sky like something being evacuated. Brooke placed the box in the trunk of her car, still holding the boots, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The silence was the kind that had weight. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with the controlled tension of someone holding themselves together through sheer muscular will. 20 years. 2 decades of hiding, of walking these corridors, of healing the broken while staying broken herself, of being invisible in plain sight. She started the car. The drive home was a corridor of streetlights, each one a marker of time passing, of distance accumulating between her and the person she'd been pretending to be. Radio traffic murmured through the speakers, nothing she listened to, just noise to fill the silence that lived in her chest. Her apartment was 30 minutes away, a small 2-bedroom in northeast Portland with a mortgage she'd paid on time for every single month, with a daughter who believed her mother was ordinary. Brooke parked in the driveway at 5:17 p.m. The house was dark. Emma was at after-school care for another 43 minutes. She had time. The kitchen table became her anchor point. She sat there in her sweat-stained scrubs, the combat boots placed deliberately in front of her like evidence of a crime. The cardboard box sat on the floor beside her, and something inside Brooke Sullivan broke, not the careful, controlled kind of breaking, but the deep fracture kind, the kind that comes from watching your entire architecture collapse. She sobbed, her shoulders heaving, her hands covering her face, 20 years of held breath escaping like air from a punctured lung. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had survived Marja. She had survived the colonel's execution of a wounded child, survived the brass asking her to forget what she'd seen, survived the erasure of her records and the dissolution of her entire identity. She had built Brooke Sullivan from nothing, planted her in Sacred Heart Hospital like a seed that nobody wanted to water, and grown her roots so deep that nobody could pull her up without destroying themselves in the process. But Dr. Sterling had tried. At 6:04 p.m., 8-year-old Emma walked through the front door with her backpack and her homework folder and her ordinary child's life. She found her mother at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking, still in her work scrubs, the boots on the table like a monument to something lost. "Mommy." Emma's voice was small, confused, the voice of a child encountering something her 8 years of life hadn't prepared her for. "Why are you home early? Why are you crying?" Brooke couldn't speak. The words existed somewhere beyond the reach of her voice. She opened her arms, and Emma climbed into her lap with the automatic trust of childhood, and Brooke held her daughter while the weight of 20 years pressed down on both of them, the weight of being a ghost, of having a name that didn't belong to you, of loving someone so much that you had to hide who you were just to keep them safe. How do you explain to your child that you've lost everything twice? That you were erased once by the Navy and a second time by a man in a white coat who saw you save a life and decided to destroy you for it? Emma pressed her face into her mother's neck and held on, not understanding, just knowing that something was terribly wrong with the world. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in Sacred Heart Hospital, the night shift was changing in the ICU. Captain Marcus Webb had been awake for an hour, groggy from sedation, his hand moving carefully to touch the sterile dressing on his chest. The edges of the bandage were smooth and professional. Underneath, he could feel the small puncture wound where a needle had passed through tissue and air and found the source of his bleeding heart. "The nurse," he whispered to the RN checking his monitor. The one who did the procedure. I need to see her. The night nurse checked the chart, her fingers moving across the tablet. Her expression shifted, that subtle change that happens when you're reading news you wish wasn't true. I'm sorry, Captain. She's no longer with the hospital. She was terminated this afternoon. Terminated. The word hung in the air like a bullet from a weapon that had just been fired. Captain Marcus Webb's breathing quickened. His hand became a fist. Show me her photo. From the badge system. The one the hospital uses for employee IDs. The nurse hesitated. HIPAA was a wall, and he was asking her to punch through it. But something in his voice, a resonance that suggested rank beyond what his current uniform indicated, made her pull up the employee database. She turned the tablet toward him. Brooke Sullivan's face filled the screen. A simple photo. Professional. Hair back. Direct gaze. No makeup. No pretense. Captain Webb stared at that face for 10 seconds. Then 12. His hand reached out and touched the screen as if he could reach through it and touch something real. His breathing became rapid, shallow, the kind of breathing that meant something fundamental had shifted in the world. Viper, he whispered. The nurse didn't understand. She frowned. I'm sorry, sir. But Captain Webb was already reaching for his phone with trembling hands. The phone felt weightless and terrifying. He scrolled through his contacts that existed in layers, the public layer and then the real layer underneath, the numbers that connected to people who existed in the spaces between officially recognized military structure. He found the number. He took a breath. He called a SEAL team leader named Commander Price. This is Captain Marcus Webb, Naval Special Warfare, he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the hospital ward like a blade through water. I need a JAG team and an FBI liaison at Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland. Right now. The voice on the other end started to ask questions, but Webb cut him off. I just found someone who's supposed to be dead. Someone who saved my life today. Someone the Navy has been hiding for 20 years. The kitchen table was still warm from where Brooke's hands had been pressed against it for the last hour. Her scrubs were still damp with sweat from the ICU, wrinkled at the elbows where she'd been gripping them like they might hold her together. The cardboard box sat on the floor beside her chair, hospital-issued tape across the bottom, her 20 years reduced to personal items and a pair of worn combat boots that she'd placed deliberately on the table's surface, as if challenging herself to look at them. Rain hammered the Portland kitchen window like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. The sobs came without warning. Not the quiet, controlled tears she'd learned in 2 decades of hiding, these were different. Deep gasping heaves that came from somewhere older than her body, somewhere that remembered being Viper, remembered Marja, remembered a 7-year-old boy bleeding out in the dust while she worked alone for 11 hours in a forward aid station nobody was coming to reinforce. The sobs shook her shoulders like they were trying to escape her chest. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, the kind of tremor that comes from holding everything in until holding isn't possible anymore. Mommy. Emma's voice was small and confused from the doorway. 8 years old. Summer dress. Backpack still on. She'd walked home from day camp expecting her mother to pick her up at 5 o'clock. Instead, she found the apartment dark and her mother crying at the kitchen table like something inside her had finally broken. Why are you home? Why are you crying? Brooke lifted her head. Tried to compose herself. The mask was too heavy right now. Come here, baby. Emma came slowly, confused, and Brooke pulled her into her arms, breathing in the smell of sunscreen and Play-Doh, trying to find the words that didn't exist. How do you tell your 8-year-old daughter that her mother has just been erased from a hospital where she'd worked for 20 years? How do you explain that sometimes the world decides you're not worth keeping, that the brave thing you did was the thing that cost you everything? How do you tell her that losing everything twice in one lifetime feels like drowning in 2 different oceans? Did something bad happen at work? Emma asked, her voice careful in the way children are careful when they sense a parent's breaking point. Yes, Brooke whispered. Something bad happened. Are you sad? Yes. Do you want to talk about it? Brooke wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell Emma that she'd saved a man's life and that the wrong man had decided she was dangerous for it. She wanted to explain that sometimes doing the right thing gets you fired by the wrong people. She wanted to tell her daughter about combat boots and call signs and a 7-year-old boy in Marja who grew up to be a Navy captain in an ICU bed. But Emma was 8. Emma needed her mother to be solid ground, not quicksand. Emma needed her to say something that made sense. Not yet, sweetheart. Maybe tomorrow. Right now, I just need to sit with you. They sat like that in the darkening kitchen, the rain still hammering outside, until Emma fell asleep against her mother's chest. Brooke carried her to bed and stood in the doorway watching her dream, wondering if this is what it meant to have everything taken twice, the first time by necessity, the second time by a man who couldn't tolerate strength in places he expected weakness. The next morning, 22 miles north at Sacred Heart, Captain Marcus Webb's eyes opened to the soft rhythm of monitors and the hiss of ventilators around him. His chest was still on fire from the emergency procedure, but his mind was sharp, clearer than it had been in days. He'd been coding. He remembered that much. He'd felt himself slipping toward something darker, the sensation of drowning in his own chest cavity until a hand came down and did something impossible. And then a voice. A woman's voice. Calm. Certain. Speaking with the kind of authority that came from having already survived impossible things. He pressed the call button for the nurse. When she arrived, a young man named Dakota with kind eyes and coffee breath, Webb grabbed his wrist. The nurse who saved me. During the code. I need to see her. I'll get someone from the charge desk, Dakota said, not understanding the urgency. Now. It's important. 5 minutes later, a charge nurse named Patricia stood beside his bed, her face uncertain. Captain, you're asking about the nurse who performed your pericardiocentesis? Yes. I need to speak with her. Patricia's expression shifted into something that looked like pity. She doesn't work here anymore. She was terminated yesterday afternoon. The room went quiet except for the ventilator's wheeze. Webb's eyes went flat. I need her file. Complete file. Medical records, personnel records, everything. Captain, I'm not sure I have the authority to. It's not a request. Get me the file or get me someone who can. 1 hour later, Webb sat propped in his hospital bed with his medical record spread across his lap, reading the notes from his code. But his eyes kept returning to one line, written in the margin of the emergency assessment, pericardiocentesis performed by Senior Charge Nurse Brooke Sullivan. His hand started shaking. Senior Charge Nurse. No. No, that wasn't the rank. That wasn't. He pressed the call button again. I need you to contact the Naval Hospital Command, he told Dakota. Tell them Captain Marcus Webb needs immediate military and federal support. Tell them I've identified someone they've been looking for. Tell them to send JG and SEAL Command to Sacred Heart Hospital. Now. Webb's voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. At exactly 11:16 a.m., a black sedan with government plates pulled up to Sacred Heart's main entrance. Kevin Torres, the hospital's IT director and a Marine Corps veteran who'd served with 1st Battalion, 5th Marines at Fallujah, was already waiting by the security office. He'd been awake since 4 a.m. reviewing the security servers after a quiet conversation with the night shift tech who'd mentioned that Dr. Sterling accessed the ICU footage system at 11 p.m. the previous evening, unusual behavior for a physician. Torres had found the deletion logs immediately. Sterling had attempted to wipe the entire incident, the captain's code, the resident freezing, Sterling's own barked orders echoing in the chaos. But Torres had the hospital's backup systems running on a secondary server, paranoid habit from his time in the military. Every frame was preserved. Every moment. The doctor's incompetence. The nurse's flawless intervention. The rage on Sterling's face when he realized he'd been overshadowed by someone he'd spent 3 hours systematically destroying. Torres had already scheduled the meeting for noon. He was standing in the CEO's office with his laptop and a folder of server logs when the black sedan arrived. He wasn't expecting the uniform, though. When the SEAL team leader and 2 JAG officers walked into Sacred Heart, every nurse at the station went absolutely still. The sound of keyboard stopping, conversations dying mid-sentence, the only noise the soft whisper of recognition from someone who understood what federal presence meant. The CEO received them in his office at 12:15 p.m. By 12:45 p.m., after Torres had played the security footage on 3 separate screens, showing Sterling's panic and Brooke's competence from multiple angles, the CEO's face had gone the color of old concrete. How long were these files in jeopardy? The CEO asked. 6 hours, Torres said. I found the deletion attempt at 4 a.m. All frames recovered. No loss. And Dr. Sterling attempted to destroy evidence of his own conduct. Deliberately. Systematically. With full knowledge of what he was deleting. Torres pulled out a sheet of paper. I have the timestamps and server logs. His login information. His access history. He knew exactly what files he was accessing. The SEAL leader, a man named Graves with silver at his temples and eyes that looked like they'd seen things that stayed seen, leaned forward. And the nurse who performed the pericardiocentesis. She's been terminated. Yesterday afternoon. Within 3 hours of the incident. On Dr. Sterling's complaint, Torres said. Graves and the 2 JAG officers exchanged a look that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Get her file, Graves said. Personnel. Medical credentials. Everything. By 2 p.m., the State Medical Board had received a formal complaint regarding Dr. Sterling's attempt to tamper with hospital evidence and his fabrication of disciplinary charges against hospital staff. By 3:41 p.m., Sterling's hospital privileges were suspended pending investigation. By 4:15 p.m., his personal attorney requested an emergency hearing to discuss potential criminal charges related to evidence destruction. By 5 p.m., board member Vaughan, who'd been so friendly to Sterling's network just days before, was calling the CEO with a prepared statement claiming he'd been misled about the situation and had no involvement in Sterling's actions. Dr. Sterling sat alone in his office on the 4th floor, the office he'd ruled like a small kingdom, and watched his career dissolve like sugar in rain. His phone had stopped buzzing by 6 p.m. The messages before that had all been the same: apologies from colleagues, resignations of friendship, carefully worded emails from his network's most prominent members explaining why they could no longer associate with him. His wife had texted only one thing: I'm at my sister's. His attorney's final email was the worst: given the federal involvement and evidence tampering, I cannot represent you. You will need to obtain criminal counsel immediately. He stared at the termination papers on his desk. 32 pages. His medical license suspension notice had arrived by courier at 5:06 p.m. 3 years. During which time he would have to complete a remedial medical ethics course, submit to ongoing peer review, and undergo mandatory anger management counseling. His hands were shaking in a way that felt like weakness, and Sterling had spent so long cultivating strength that weakness felt like drowning. The real moment of destruction came when he watched through his office window as a Navy honor guard, for service members in dress uniforms carrying a flag, escorted a woman in Navy service dress blues through the hospital's front entrance. Her dark hair was pulled back in the military bun he'd seen in military documentaries. Her bearing was absolutely upright. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds before thunder. And walking beside her was Kevin Torres, who looked at her the way men look at legends they've only read about in classified files. Investigator Marcia Chen had already completed her review. Her memo, hand-delivered to the CEO with 3 copies for Sterling's file, was categorical: no violations found. All interventions within scope and standard of care. Nursing assessment and decision-making exemplary. Recommend full exoneration of Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Sterling's hands went completely numb when he read those words. The Navy doesn't send honor guards for nurses. The Navy doesn't send SEAL team leaders and JAG officers for malpractice investigations. The Navy doesn't classify someone's employment records unless those records contain things that nations keep locked away. And Sterling had just spent the last 72 hours trying to destroy a woman who wasn't a nurse at all. She was a Navy warrior wearing a uniform under her scrubs. That night, alone in his apartment with the news muted on television and a whiskey he couldn't taste, Dr. Sterling understood finally what it meant to have made an irreversible error. To have picked a fight with someone whose battle scars were written in languages he'd never learned to read. The reckoning was complete. He destroyed himself far more efficiently than any investigation could have managed. But for Brooke, at home in Portland in a quiet apartment where her daughter slept, the real reckoning was just beginning. If you've made it this far, you already know this is one of the most important stories we tell, stories about the quiet warriors among us who refuse to break even when the world tries to shatter them. Subscribe to see what happens when Brooke steps forward and finally stops hiding. And please, hit that like button and comment, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? We'll see you in the next segment.